This is Diplomacy, written by Kraiva, Somniate, and Trin, SSJTrinity. Part 3 of Surrogate, the Director's Cut. The rating is teen and up audiences. No archive warnings apply. The relationship category is general. The fandom is Malevolent, the podcast.
Additional tags. Kane is here, but he goes unnamed. It's not super extended or anything, but Kane is definitely a bit inappropriate with the protagonist. Espionage. Eavesdropping. Voices by Isii as Lori, Igneous as Kuranes, Kane, and a guard, Jasper as Arthur and Avis, Lynn Larsh as John, Dorona, Stodgy Number 1, and Canna Dar, Flamia as Hoster, Vampirism as the narrator and Faro, SSJTrinity and Ace as the bandits, Somniate as Stodgy Number 2, Shalgrith as Stodgy Number 3, Bryce as Stodgy Number 4. Crowd voices by Somniate, Igneous, and Lynn Larsh, SSJTrinity, Kraiva, and Somniate as the work introduction. Editing by Flamia. Directed by Vampirism. Transcript by Saffron. Created and posted with permission from the authors of Surrogate, the Director's Cut.
The city of Celophaeus receives word that Hastur is opening his palace for a mysterious event. Kuranes, the dreaming king of the city, responds by sending his best diplomat.
Chapter 1. Travel.
Kuranes asked her to meet with him, or perhaps summoned was more appropriate. Although only the people of the Dreamlands considered him a king, the fact of the matter was that Lorraine was a fellow dreamer. She wasn't overly deferential to him. Both were born on Earth, and possibly because of that, Kuranes asked her to be his diplomat. Diplomacy was a wild job in the Dreamlands. It could be as simple as speaking to another visiting diplomat, simply checking on how allies were doing.
It could be tense, and Lorraine had frequently wondered if she would be dead and her skin sent to Kuranes as a message.
Shooting the messenger to send a message back was a readily accepted form of communication in the Dreamlands, after all. Like any Englishman expecting company, he had afternoon tea prepared for them when Lorraine arrived. That was familiar enough. The expression on his face, perhaps, a bit worried. To the side and behind him, the window had opened on a view of the bay and the ship sailing the last few meters to the harbor.
It smelled like the beach, and when the breeze caught just right, Lorraine smelled night-blooming flowers and moon-blooming flowers, and flowers that only bloomed when you whispered a secret to them.
It would be sunset soon. The city was relatively safe. People didn't have to be overly vigilant of crime or night gaunts, and quite wealthy. The harbor let them sit, perfectly placed, to be a trade route for all sorts of things, but only a few places had some of the culture that they had. Celophaeus was known for the craftsmanship of her musical instruments and was known for her musicians. Plenty of people came to the city to take up an apprenticeship, or at the very least, to learn from the masters of any number of genre or instrument. Lorraine took her gaze away from the window. It was strange that Kuranes hadn't asked if she liked the view. It was a running joke that they had. She'd gaze out the window, and Kuranes would ask what she thought. The way she felt would always be a pun about the weather. Kuranes liked wordplay, and he also liked to know that people loved his city, the love of his life. There were times when Lori wondered if she was right about him being married to the city. Could Celophaeus have a genus loci?
I think the future looks absolutely optimistic.
She waited. Kuranes sat in his chair, and his eyes didn't meet hers. Lori finally looked down at what he was looking at. On the table, so easily missed when you were looking right past it, was a letter where she would sit, and it bore the yellow sign. Lori felt cold, like she was deep underground, like she was somewhere dark and cold, and there were heavy noises in the distance. It did not feel quite real.
Which one of us is that addressed to?
Because if it was addressed to him, that would be incredibly bad. It would be awful if it was addressed to her, but for different reasons. Lori would probably have to decide if she wanted to die now or later, but if it was addressed to Kuranes...
To me?
He didn't stop to let Lori mull through it before continuing.
Is a summons from the King in Yellow. Now, I think I'm reading it correctly, but I want you to look and tell me if you disagree. Because Lori, I'm gonna be honest, we can't say no.
This isn't something we can avoid, okay? Let me look at that summons before we borrow trouble.
The envelope was embossed with gold. Lori had the ridiculous thought that it was a very expensive piece of paper. It was a ridiculous brag, and it was a classy statement at the same time. The letter inside was another piece of very nice paper. And would she ever have thought about the quality of a piece of stationery any other goddamn time, except when her brain was screaming in terror?
We might maybe be able to, go unnoticed? Or earn just enough favor to be ignored in the future? And it looks like I could probably come home. I don't feel great about this, but I think I can.
Yes, that's what I came to the conclusion of too.
Kuranes took a drink from his tea.
When you go, we send a gift. Something carefully chosen.
Lori leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The smell of the tea mingled with the rest of the scent in the air. There was something wildly endearing about a city somehow smelling good. It went against all logic and thus could only exist here.
Boss, if I play my cards right, we could find out some things. Like, some rumors.
Hey, you said that, not me.
Yeah, don't I know it. After everything that was floating around, the opportunity to get some real information, to find out why the king got really active after so many millennia quiet. Not to mention the city. We can't forget about that.
He winced. There was something uniquely horrific about what had happened to Carcosa. The inhabitants of the city had been massacred as easily as setting fire to an anthill. Not shortly afterwards, Hastur had repopulated the city. That was its own circle of hell. At least he hadn't stolen anyone from Celophaeus.
It's bizarre. I haven't been around long, but it feels like an astronomical event. 10 or so years ago, he reacted very violently to something that happened. There were rumors about a portal. Something with a cult on Earth had gone wrong. Except nothing seems obviously wrong with him. Or if there is, we haven't been able to tell. Which could make just as much sense as anything, really. I mean, Hastur flexes his muscles for the first time in however long, and then just as fast he's done. Now he's throwing an event. I don't know. Maybe he wants to show off his new population.
An event we can't say no to.
Now that the initial shock had passed, Lorraine was ready for triage.
Alright, well, we'll think of something then. Tribute. What's representative of the city?
Something from one of the master artists.
Not from one we like a lot.
Oh, I know a few greatly skilled assholes. If they vanish, we can lose them.
Kuranes?
What? Don't act like you weren't thinking it.
It's true, but you can't say that sort of thing aloud.
Lori was amused despite herself, despite all of this.
The king loves theater and dancing. I don't want to task someone with making a nice piece of tapestry. That's too long for what we need, and I don't think we have that much yellow.
Kuranes laughed at that. He cast his eyes around the room, thoughtful, and Lori turned her gaze to the sailing ships. Sure, Carcosa was near a lake, but no.
A musical instrument.
Lori watched as lumber was removed from a ship.
Something beautiful, but something that can be pretty for the sake of being pretty. And then also stable and crafted well enough to be a musical instrument if someone did want to play it.
Tapestries are very ephemeral too. We don't want him to think that we're giving him something that's just gonna vanish in a couple 100 years.
If we had more time, we could do an organ or something. Big and dramatic and a lot of shiny metal.
Lori remembered seeing one in a field trip she went on one time. It towered over her, and at the time it felt like seeing an otherworldly creature. She'd been 6 and had no idea she would see true otherworldly creatures someday. Kuranes looked through a leatherback book on his desk.
If I didn't write this down, I'd forget half of it. But that's just a good thing about living a long life. You learn how to live with yourself. Here we are. Some of the master artisans in the city, and some that are up and coming. Have a biscuit, and then you can take a look.
She did. Kuranes said that he wanted the city to be beloved, and certainly the musicians and craftspeople did. They came from near and far, and some weren't even from Earth.
What about, one of those little plinky things? You hold them in your hands and play with your thumbs. I saw someone playing one along the river. I quite enjoyed that.
Little plinky thing. Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. I know their name.
We'll figure it out. What do you think of the idea?
I don't know how much they cost to make, so we'll make it quite fashionable.
Lorraine thought of how she could present the gift. A lot of times, the presenting of a gift, especially to royalty, was so much about being deferential and scraping the ground for them.
I think I can spin this. I don't want to get hopeful yet, but I think I could.
We have some time. If we can't find the little plinky thing, we'll... I know there are violins, cellos, maybe a flute.
Cellos are massive. I'm going to be traveling with this thing.
Well, not alone. Don't be a fool, Lori.
All the same, I think it might be a good idea. Small enough to travel well, large enough to be an art piece, but sturdy enough if someone wanted to play it. If we could make it out of skin and bone, we'd be all set.
Travel was far from impossible in the Dreamlands. If anything, it was encouraged. Hospitality was sacrosanct, and while travelers could be seen as an easy target, a traveler who would be expected to appear in the court of the King in Yellow was a different thing entirely. A group of bandits had tried to take her wagon at dusk, and while it may have come to blows if her escorts had less patience, all Lorraine had needed to do was hold the letter.
It could be a fake,
one of them had said.
A fake? Are you fucking stupid? The only thing worse for her than it being real would be it being fake. Imagine if word got to one of his cultists.
They left, unharmed, not even a penny shorter. Lorraine felt sweat bead and roll down her back, all the same. It could have gone bad. If they were robbed and the instrument was stolen, then they were out a gift. There was a chance they could find something else along the way. Not impossible, but Lorraine didn't want to try it. If they were attacked and the wagon damaged, or set fire to out of spite, the instrument might survive. Lorraine was overthinking this. She was borrowing trouble. No, the instrument, a well-made kalimba that looked like something from a dream, was a sturdy thing, and it wouldn't just fall apart if it was breathed on funny. Lori had come to the opinion that the speech she gave when presenting the gift would be extremely important. She could state that they could never presume to know what treasures Hastur already had. It would be important to state that Kuranes had hoped that the gift would be a genuine tribute, meant to show their city's strengths. So no, she wasn't stressed at all. It made her think, briefly, back to college. Late nights and trying to bullshit an essay together with other students. There would be different drinks on the counter, a crock pot as well as a hot pot, and numerous snacks from different stores. It would snow, hard flakes hitting the windows. Lori had felt stressed, could feel her heart pounding, and then someone would tell a joke.
Where are you when you're in the bathroom? You're a peeing.
She would laugh, and her worry would return to a simmer. Someone would ask, "Help me phrase this better," and another person would. Lori had appreciated that someone could understand her enough to get to the heart of what she meant. It had felt good. It had felt like companionship, and even in the times she had been struggling, because, yes, she had been, hadn't she? She hadn't felt alone or adrift, and yes, school was miserable, but it would pass. All would be well, and all manner of thing would be well. There had been times when she thought that this was one of the worst days in her life, but no, kiddo, she thought. She'd never had a true medical scare. She'd never been in a true accident. At that time, she had not found her way to the Dreamlands. Lori imagined she was back in that room. She tried to imagine how they'd advise her speech, telling her to get to the point, to make a statement, to ensure it was heartfelt. "It's the difference between a cheap card and good stationery," one of her friends had said, and it was a message she meant to apply. The wagon rattled, and Lori could still smell the samosas. She stopped, opened a window, and looked out. They had left the city gates. And there were no buildings that would cook food, let alone samosas from the Indian restaurant in the middle of town. Had Lori slipped up? Fuck. There were no changes to the area visible to her. Something very large would be noticed, and might be taken offense to. Smaller things were considered beneath notice, but all the same, she couldn't just transform a good portion of the Dreamlands into a university in Chicago at any time she wanted. Yet. She was borrowing trouble, or maybe she was minimizing the danger of what just happened. One of the stars was changing. Lori felt herself yawn. It had been a long day, and her sleep had been relatively poor the last few days. Kuranes had sent her with sleeping tonics, but Lori would save them, if she could, until she was a day away from Carcosa. She would arrive well-rested, and she would be well-rested the day of the event. While it didn't seem like she was walking to her doom, if she was, she'd hate to go on a poor night of sleep. The Dreamlands had gorgeous landscapes, and she loved getting to see them and enjoy them. There were beautiful places on Earth. Lori got to see some of them. It had always been part of her plan after college, then her plan after "I've been at this job long enough," and then so on and so forth. At one point in her life, Lori had wondered if her best years were in the past. She hadn't peaked in high school, but she'd peaked in college, and wasn't that close enough? Lori wanted to be able to tell that nervous child, because 20 had been young, wasn't it? That it would be stranger than she had ever thought. stranger and more adventurous and better. Lori wanted to tell her to be patient, that it would be worth it. Things felt worth it, and if she left Carcosa safely, then it was just the normal matter of traveling home. Lori had done that. Lori closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she saw Carcosa on the horizon.
Chapter 2. Whispers.
Well, even if the trip was shorter than expected, she still had time to freshen up and wear her nicest clothes. Travel was travel, even when the invitation came from something ancient and inhuman, but she wouldn't be called scruffy by any means. A bad impression now could make her path easy, or could make it a crucible.
There's gonna be a lot of security,
Avis told her.
Do you want to get changed before they approach or after?
Do they look like they're manhandling people?
From a distance, it looked simple enough. The guards, tall beings, not remotely humanoid, things with fins on their heads and too many limbs and a color that made things around it seem hazy, were greeting people, bowing in their general direction and flitting the tips of their tentacles in the air all around them. It didn't look like anyone was being touched, but they were certainly being perused.
It seems a simple enough process. I'm not observing any... Oh dear.
One of the visitors had not passed muster. Instead of waving languidly, the tentacles stabbed. The screech rattled her carriage windows, but it didn't last long. The offending visitor was simply carted off very quickly, weird green blood spraying everywhere, and another such guard stepped in to take its place. Everything continued as normal. Carriages and other transports continued slowly into the city. Lorraine kept looking for signs of repair, but perhaps this part of Carcosa had been left unharmed. Gossip seemed to be making its way down the line. A different guard, this one looking almost human, except for long, curling horns, meandered casually by, muttering from the side of his mouth.
No weapons. Nothing that could hurt a human. No weapons. Nothing that could hurt a human.
Which was a damned odd thing for him to be saying, given that most of the beings here could hurt a human whether armed or not. Behind the carriage, cursing rose into the air, followed by little magic zaps and heavy metal clunks. Weapons were being discarded or destroyed.
It appears you will be given an escort once past the guards.
Well, I suppose that's less bloodshed than I'd expected.
No weapons was fine, although it did stand out. The previous times she'd come to Carcosa, this hadn't happened. Aster was going to prevent bloodshed at this event? Or was looking to minimize it? That couldn't be something he cared regularly about. Elder gods just didn't.
Well, Avis, you know what I tell you.
Don't add, subtract, or marry into any population.
That's and behave.
She smiled at him.
I'll see you soon.
An escort didn't bother her that much. Of all the things happening, or that could happen, an escort was par for the event. This much Lori was handling. The carriage made its way forward. Someone opened the door for her, providing a stepping stool. The guards loomed, tentacles waving, but she was greeted by name, the syllables of which echoed like something from miles underneath the ground coming to surface, and then waved on through. The door to this place was large. Naturally, it was large, given the size of some of the things that had to slither through it, but still, it was difficult not to feel awed and minimized passing between those doors. The foyer was fairly full, not only with invited guests, but with the escorts Avis mentioned, smart-looking beings in neat black uniforms with yellow piping, polite enough to magically and distinctly resemble their new companions. A few people glanced her way. They took in her stature, her distinct humanity. No one seemed shocked, particularly, but just as quickly, they looked away. Good hell, there was a lot of peacocking going on in here. Guests were strutting, displaying odd, glittering cloaks, tilting multiple heads so the light caught their jewels, stepping just so to allow their musical shoes to jingle and trill their every step. Beautiful, and of course it was gorgeous. Lori knew she was surrounded by monsters. She was fine, and it would be fine, and all manner of thing would be well. She kept her eyes open. This was a palace. The owner of the palace wanted everyone to feel small and weak. On the other side of the foyer, a man leaned against the wall, striking only because he'd avoided any frippery. He at least seemed human. He also seemed bored. He was not bad-looking, not striking, not really anything. Just ordinary, symmetrical, brown hair, tan skin. And so bored. How anyone could be bored in this room was a wonder, but this person managed. His clothing wasn't quite the same as Haster's servants. It was black sans yellow piping, but no one looked his way at all. If he was a servant, he wasn't serving. He stood there, surveying the room, arms crossed, foot tapping. Her view was cut off by someone in servant's garb. This person had done a decent job of trying to look human for her, and so must be her escort.
The party from Salafeus.
She was holding a card with the symbol of Lori's city on it. The servant's vertical pupils widened to take Lori in.
Yes, I am.
Excellent. I am Canadar, and I will be your...
The Canna blinked twice, shook her head, and said in a blunted voice,
Just a moment, please.
Then she turned around, handed the card to the man behind her, and stiffly walked off. It was the man who'd been on the opposite side of the foyer. Well, he was here now, peering at Lori, eyes narrowed with focus. The small smile on his lips seemed a dangerously far cry from bored.
Well, knock me down with a feather. A rep from Salafeus. Wasn't sure what they'd send to this, but I sure as hellfire didn't expect you. How is Kuranes these days, anyway?
Well, that's a message well and sent. The Canna walking off was unexpected, but when the man in black approached and spoke to her, at least she knew why. Sort of.
Well, we were invited, and what would it be to refuse it?
A death sentence. It would be a death sentence.
Kuranes as well. Who shall I say asked after him?
A pause, and she raised an eyebrow.
Should I say someone asked after him?
The man waved his hand, made a face.
Nah, he wouldn't remember me. I mean, my product, sure. Gave him some damn good stuff back in the day, which all went into that place. I mean, a city built from the dreams of a homeless drug addict?
He leaned in, eyes sparkling, smiling with all teeth shown.
That's good stuff. Fun to watch for years. Until he got all serious.
But hey, we're not here to talk about him. Let's talk about you.
How's all that horticulture going?
She registered all that quickly enough. This person knew about Kuranes' past and about Salafeus. As for the horticulture...
Sounds like he won't. The gardens or my houseplants? I can complain humorously about some of the issues I've had with one of my houseplants. Some of these things, you have to baby them. Sometimes worth it. You know, I don't believe I got your name. And if I assume you know mine, do I assume right?
As she spoke, he was odd. He kept nodding, kept saying the expected polite things.
Oh, yes. Ah, right.
But he did them wrong. Too much, too wild a nod, too much an expression. Was he being patronizing? No. This was something worse, making a mockery of this entire situation and doing so utterly without fear of reprisal. The moment she finished, he grinned again.
Lori! Lori. You know, that's a good point. Some of these idiots have to be babied, or they just up and die. And then you get no harvest. What a smart thing to say. I think I like you.
And without warning, he hooked an arm through hers.
Don't worry,
he said before she could react.
I'm not gonna hurt you right now. You're the only interesting thing in this room.
So that was terrible. Lori didn't bother trying to fight the hold.
In spite of reason, she was curious to feel the fabric and what existed under it. Chances were, there could be nothing at all.
She nodded.
Oh, this will be a boring party if I'm carrying the whole thing. But that's rude of me. I can't imagine you letting anything remain dull for too long.
Apparently, she couldn't have said anything better.
Wanna play I Spy for a bit?
Lori glanced at him out of her peripheral vision, an eyebrow cocked.
I haven't played in ages. Let's.
And if she noticed that the arm in hers was firm and a little too warm, well, what did it matter? The material over it was nice anyway, soft, like cotton. Whatever he was, he didn't seem aggressive right now, and playing along was the best way to keep things staying that way. He threw back his head. And, oh, that laugh was not right. That laugh was too much. That laugh hurt a little to hear, but he didn't keep it up too long.
I hope he pays you well, Lori. Or I might just have to poach you.
Lori knew that in a couple of weeks she was going to have a good ear infection. She always got one after hearing something like that laugh. But hell.
Flatterer?
Her voice light enough that it was obvious she'd taken it as a compliment. He grinned.
I spy with my little eye. A union about to go kablooey.
And he pointed. Two beings were showing off for one another in the corner. They were odd, elephantine creatures, bipedal but clumsy, like they'd been created from clumps of clay just stuck together and left unshaped. And it was not at all clear if they were fighting or flirting. They were leaned in too close. They gestured with wide, clunky arms. Whatever they said, more than a few of the beings around them began to draw back, pretending not to notice, yet giving space.
See, those two,
said the nameless weirdo,
are siblings. Not that that sort of thing matters among, gods. They're all related, dear heart. It's worse than the Adam and Eve conundrum. But those two? They're not supposed to get together. Mumsy Dearest put them in two different quadrants of her kingdom. But, watch. Wait for it. There.
The elephantine beings pressed their stubby arms together where they would have had hands, and her impression of clay didn't seem to be too far off, because when they pulled their arms apart, the texture went from smooth to spiky, like dough stuck to something and then pulled away. The man grinned.
They just made a baby. Right there. In 3 months, Lori, there is gonna be one hell of an order for war trumpets coming your way. Might want to stock up on brass.
Yikes.
Well, Children get in trouble when they're left alone, no matter their age.
She considered the timeline, 3 months, a brass order.
I'll have to tell my boss.
But now it was her turn. Lori scanned the foyer.
Do you see that group over there? The one with their eyes in a circle around their head. Ursunchen is his name. They're from Hellanith. I know that his current position as vizier is precarious. The current story is that he took over for his predecessor, Hinver, after Hinver was declared guilty of treason against the people. Said that he was stealing tax money. Well, it's in the wrong order. Hinver was assassinated before the trial, but it had to keep going as though he were alive, so...
She nodded, feeling grim amusement.
They puppeted the body. I understand there were wooden sticks involved to make his limbs move.
Ooh!
The man grinned again.
That wasn't half bad! You have an eye, I see. If you see what I did there. Let's see. I spy with my little eye. A conversation we have got to be a part of. Hold your breath, love.
Don't have to tell me twice.
She followed his lead. It wasn't a pleasant transition. At least it was quick. In a blink, in a moment of pressure and speed and the sense of airless space, they left the foyer to arrive on a balcony dizzyingly high above the Dreamlands. Right next to it was another balcony, this one occupied by 4 horrifying beings of madness and indignity. They were clearly Cthulhu's get, the 4-dimensional smearings, the tentacles, the horrible eyes. Then suddenly, they looked like 4 stodgy old white men in suits.
Sorry about that. Easier on the eyes like that, right? I mean, technically. Nobody wants to have to see those guys naked either.
She had a brief vision of the stodgy old white men without their suits.
On both accounts. We're not here for the eye candy, though.
This was fine. She could do this. Lori lifted her embroidered handkerchief to wipe a bit of blood that dribbled down from her eye and her nostril.
And yes, you're right. Easier.
Tough little Shayla. Hey, let's not get distracted.
He pressed his thumb to her forehead. The headache vanished. The blood stopped dripping. Her vision cleared. He blew off his thumb as if it were a gun in an old western.
Don't take it for granted now.
He cocked his head like he was listening in to something else, something she couldn't hear.
Aw, shucks. Look at the time. I'm about to miss a very interesting conversation regarding the sacking of Carcosa. See you around, Lori Keat.
And like a chalk picture being erased, he deteriorated until he disappeared. It was truly uncomfortable. So that was bad. 1, was that what the incident in Carcosa was going to be called? The implications of that weren't good alone. Secondly, the man was just dropping her here, leaving, then going to reappear at any time? The entity was impulsive, had power, and the way of it felt not false, but an act. Exaggerated, perhaps. Lori knew that some actors would use that as a method. Theatrical, then. That would be something to talk about later. Lori heard voices next to her, and her ears caught the relaying. That wasn't strange. She knew it when she heard it, especially from the mouths of the species that had created it. What was strange was that she understood it easily. Or perhaps the best comparison was listening to a news story where someone was translating quickly for another person. It felt entirely too possible that the voices for the stodgy Squidget were parodies done by the entity.
Then,
said stodgy number 1.
She just saunters in as arrogant as you please, and acts like nothing happened at all.
Stodgy number 2 made a sort of hum noise, further providing evidence for her theory.
The nerve.
Stodgy number 3 nodded.
I mean, we all heard about it.
The carnage was extreme,
said stodgy number 4.
I heard he did it himself in a fit of rage when they offered him undercooked meats.
She had heard about the carnage. There were conflicting accounts, namely, on the number of assailants there had been, whether it had been an army or a small mercenary band. No one had come forward to claim the attack, which, in itself, had been bizarre. Everyone waited, watching, to see who would move first. So far, no one had. Which, it wasn't done. Lori also did not believe that Hastur had done it himself. Neither had Kuranes. One of her informants had come to her. Her eyes had been wild, the tension lines at the corners of them exaggerated.
I was there,
Dorona said to her.
I saw the aftermath. It looked like a war crime. It feels like I was in a place that had just been sacked, ma'am.
Dear God, and you're sure it was an act of war?
I think so. There were buildings toppled, like bombs went off. Bodies everywhere. But it felt... something about it was wrong. Maybe because I wasn't one of the first people there, but I don't think a lot of people were killed immediately.
As in shot to harm, then shot to kill?
Dorona nodded.
Yes, sort of. I'm sorry. Ma'am, please don't make me talk more about this right now. I haven't slept properly in a few days, and I need to sleep a bit before I give the rest of the report.
Of course.
The next evening, Dorona arrived in her office and sat at the desk. She didn't look wild-eyed and frightened anymore, and she was able to give an extremely satisfactory report for Lorraine and Kuranes. Dorona and Lori would never speak of anything to do with Carcosa ever again. Lori knew that if she'd asked, Dorona would look into more information about it, but Lori also knew that it would hurt her deeply to do so. Dorona had done enough.
Nonsense. Someone did it to him. Probably because of, all that madness before it happened. He did go quite strange for a while there, didn't he? He even came to my realm, if you can believe it. Demanded the texts, pulled through them, then got all pissy and stormed off again. Not so much as a by your leave.
That would fit with it being an act of war. That would fit with something odd happening 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? Also, she'd have to remember to ask Kuranes about what the texts might be.
What was he even looking for? Did anybody ever find out?
No. Not that I heard, anyway. Whatever it was, I have to assume he found it.
It did stop rather suddenly. Suspiciously so, if you ask me.
Oh, my dears! You haven't heard the latest! A little bird told me he visited Earth a few weeks ago.
Nonsense! Why?
Could it have something to do with that portal nonsense from a few years ago? I never quite understood that. My spies said something about the Dark World and the book. I don't know. None of it made a lick of sense.
Oh, not a lick, I agree.
Portal nonsense. Portal nonsense that could coincide with something 10 years ago that set off a generally predictable elder god? Stodgy number 3 leaned forward.
Well, would you like to know what I've heard?
They all leaned in, of course.
What? I heard quite the tale, and, well, it came from someone who ate a cultist, an earth cultist, so really, take it with a grain of salt.
Poor crazy fuckers!
Indeed. Oh, the cultist told the elder one who ate him that they'd been tasked with freeing...
Number 3 looked so proud.
...the most important person to our elegant host.
They all stared at him.
Most important person?
But there is a most important person?
Number 2 looked lost. Even Laurie snorted. Number 1 shook his head.
Nonsense!
Well, the cultist was sure.
The cultists were stupid. Also, eaten, and one might say anything then.
Maybe that's what today is about. Perhaps he's revealing his queen.
And they all had a very good laugh, punctuated with herms and haroms and hms. A queen was bullshit. Elder gods didn't treat titles and royalty the same as humans did. Humans swapped a great deal of nobility and gentry nonsense from them, but stole it poorly and without really understanding. A bird parroting a word.
That would explain all of this.
You think a human queen? What else could it be? The weapons, the earth visit.
The madness of searching the old texts.
But what about Carcosa?
Maybe he destroyed Carcosa as an attempt to impress a queen. I hear humans like mindless violence.
No, they don't like it.
Yes, they do.
No, they don't.
This was going nowhere. Laurie wanted to know more about the text, but rated it a lower priority. The fact that weapons were being removed at the door was clearly relevant to all of this. Laurie took her leave, climbing through the balcony's window. Maybe it was an oversight on behalf of the entity to not simply make a door, or maybe it was a little snicker to see a woman of a certain age try to climb through the window in a formal outfit. Either one said something, but something different. There were voices coming from outside the room, although they were far enough away to be hard to make out. Laurie's hip popped in complaint for making her lift it that way when it had not been alerted it would need to do that beforehand.
Help to put this fucking thing on.
The next voice bypassed her eardrums and assorted tiny bones and went right into her mind.
You did fine. You look fine.
I look like a clown. Or a kid, dressed up in his dad's uniform, or something.
He's trying to humiliate you. Just don't let it get to you.
Well, that was certainly some pep talk, but where was the other speaker? The ghost of handsomeness lingered, but he was far too thin. Scars peeked here and there, including a horrific one across his throat. His eyes were curious. Laurie was able to see their color, which was a lovely golden color. Not the most common eye color among humans, and the way he was moving them was a little uncanny. Laurie made a note of that. Frequently, he would keep his head completely still and move his eyes to the farthest they could go to the side. The emotion centered around his eyes felt tenser in a different way.
Stop here.
The man did.
Turn left for me. Let me see.
So the man did, looking into the polished, reflective stone of the wall. It was like a black mirror, probably wouldn't be any good for makeup, but for this, it was fine. He might look good in formal wear, but this outfit was a clear attempt to humiliate him. The man's left hand rose and smoothed down his hair. Laurie was seeing something she shouldn't be. The gilded scarecrow trembled slightly. but his hand remained still. The left hand moved languidly, and there was something familiar about that movement that made little hairs on the back of her neck rise. There was a pause.
How did she look? John, please.
His voice cracked, only once. The eyes didn't look at his reflection. They seemed angry or irritated, and Lori wouldn't want to be the one on the other end of that look. The other part of her knew how important getting information like this in times of upheaval was, and oh God, this was important. This man had so little dignity. The voice growled like an earthquake. But then, miraculously, it answered.
She looks like a little jewel, sparkly. Yellow, of course, but like if the feel of the night sky were turned into a dress for a child.
The man smiled in the reflection.
Thank you. Ready?
Yes. You?
No. Let's go.
Right and straight.
The man walked on, and Lori was left standing in the wake. That was not Karloff, and they were talking about a child. Lori had experience doing enough things that she didn't want to do, but had to do, to know the exact tone of the pair. Pair of what was the question, wasn't it? There had been something vulnerable between them. Yellow, of course, and the sound of it was strange. Lori took a step forward, then stopped. Weapons that could harm a human removed. The rumors that Hastur had taken a wife were bullshit, of course, but the pair she saw were talking about a child. Decorated in sparkly clothing, expensive clothing. The feeling of tension and sorrow from this man, who was a human, who was one of the handful of humans around, whose eyes and arm moved oddly in a way that made Lori's lizard brain shriek and scurry, a fear response. Lori had met other dreamers from Earth. One of the things she tried to tell them was how the Dreamlands were dangerous and beautiful. Dorona had asked Lori the time she realized she wanted to stay in the Dreamlands for as long as she could. Lori told her what she told everyone. One of the first few years she was in the Dreamlands, Lori joined a group as extra hands for extra cash. They wanted to try to find another party of people who'd entered the jungle some time before. None expected to find any survivors, and they hadn't. She'd been on perfectly solid ground one second, and the next she was falling and in icy cold water. She had been winded by it, unable to make a sound. People didn't understand that. Lori hit the water and gasped from the cold and shock. Looking up at the blue sun and seeing the glowworms deeper in the cave and the beautiful green water, Lori could remember it as one of the most beautiful sights she'd ever seen. The Dreamlands were beautiful and terrible. The eyes in the face of the man earlier had been gorgeous. Lori had felt like she was trying to keep distance between herself and a jaguar. The easy, powerful movement had been familiar enough to shake her this badly. Why? The event would begin very soon. She needed to get moving.
Good question.
The being who'd punted her up there still wasn't bothering with introductions. He'd gotten a drink now, some unlikely thing with an umbrella bigger than the whole glass and an eerie purple sheen.
I took you for a martini person, though maybe a Bloody Mary would have also fit.
Of course, he popped up right in front of her when she turned around, exactly where he hadn't been a moment before. Lori felt her heart slam against the ribcage protecting it, and she jumped in place, and now she was doing her job and catching her breath and going with the flow.
That man wasn't alone. The one with the gold eyes. Did you enjoy listening to that conversation of yours?
I sure did. Wouldn't be around if I didn't. Also, her name wasn't Mary, it was Andrew.
He smiled, the purple stuff clinging to his teeth like blood.
Well, remind me to never ask you for a cup of joe.
She looked in the direction the man went. It was low, an almost surprised sound.
Well, well, well. Repartee, banter, cleverness. You know, you're putting me in a better mood after all. And no, he wasn't alone.
There was something very transactional about the way he did that, as if he intended to keep talking if she made it worth his time. He was watching her now, eyes lidded, unreadable. He licked purple from his lips, and it was a hungry thing. Lori's lips twitched at the corner.
The conversation you dropped me at. Some interesting bits and pieces. But they're wrong about the entire queen thing. Haster doesn't need one. Meanwhile, the pair I just saw...
She reached up, briefly, and rubbed a small scar along her jawline.
They were talking about a child, dressed expensively, in the king's colors. You know, at first, I thought the person he was speaking to was in a different room, with how he was describing the girl. But he was there, inside the body, and directing his movements like some kind of seeing eye dog. His pep talk wasn't great either.
Lori stopped, then frowned, taking her eyes off him. Later, she would chide herself for this.
No, the king is presenting a child? Is that why people have this harebrained notion that it's a queen? But that doesn't make any sense.
She blinked and leaned back like she stood too close to something too bright. He was gone? Lori didn't even hear him. No, he was right behind her, and his lips touched her ear for just a moment.
That is not half bad. More than I expected from this group of numbnuts.
He swung around her like he was on a stripper pole, no physics applied, no one noticing, and perched in front of her, leaning like a mime on absolutely nothing.
What else you got?
She had more of his attention now. It carried a weight. Something very important was happening here.
None of this makes any damn sense, though.
Something in the back of her mind started to take shape. Dough rising in a bowl between steps in bread making.
I'm getting the shape of it. There's a couple of things I'm still missing. I suspect if I stay around and I do a good job at the debut, I'm going to see this all clearly. It'll be awful.
Lori said it like she was discussing a grocery list for all the familiarity and ease she used.
Say it.
He was unsmiling. It felt like fate of some kind rested on the head of a pin, perfectly balanced.
Say what you guess. Right now.
I recognize the movements, motions, of the parts of that man that he did not control.
Lori met his gaze.
I think I've run across this passenger before, during my times in the Dreamlands, though I couldn't tell you where.
Lori finished, finally looking away, looking in thought.
Well?
He straightened, coming up off the invisible, possibly non-existent shelf.
And what do you think of their conversation?
And with his attention, the room had slightly dimmed. Everything around her seemed to be moving just a tiny bit slower. This guess, whatever it was was the linchpin on which this whole moment rested. It would swing one way or another, depending on what she said. His smile was sharp like broken ice.
No wrong answers. Do your best. Go on.
They seemed like they liked each other. The human man, is he really pushed back against the one with his hands and eyes? A little bit of push between them, but they seemed like they were familiar with each other. I suppose I'm dancing around saying the word intimacy. But I can't imagine you'd have anything else in a situation like theirs. Keep in mind, I only caught a brief exchange with them. Maybe they're just being amenable like everyone else is for this whole thing.
The hardness seemed to have left his face, not that what was left was in any way warm or cuddly.
And the child they spoke of?
Lori knew. Lori knew and felt her heart skip in her chest like she'd missed a step.
I focused on the fact that there were two of them. It's...
She felt herself stall for a moment.
He took this human's daughter? That's a punishment, obviously. But instead of doing whatever nightmare thing to her, he's taking her as his own? What? Was this man one of the king's cultists that really fucked up? And all of this is a punishment for not succeeding to the king's satisfaction? Or maybe this human is a prison for an enemies of Haster's? It would explain why they seemed so certain this would all go badly for them, and why that man seemed so ragged.
He stared. His eyes were wise, and for a long moment, he stared. Then he threw back his head and laughed. And oh, it hurt. Everything around them slowed even further, moving in bullet time, and it all flickered dark for that one horrible moment. But then he stopped. And it was all normal, and people were tittering and gossiping and exchanging info, and he was just a guy. The smile was real and somehow worse than his unsmiling face. He leaned in.
I amend my former statement. Very clever. Not one other idiot in this whole place came even close. And you're close, Lori Keat. Honestly, a little too close? Let's just ensure that doesn't get you killed,
And he leaned in, hands on her shoulders and cheek brushing hers, and bit down on her earlobe. It wasn't hard, but a wash of heat spread out from it, spreading like oil over her brain, then gone. And in the next blink, he was back where he was, drink in hand, the umbrella larger, and had gone bright orange.
Just shielded your thoughts. Don't thank me or anything. Couldn't let such a clever little bird get plucked that quickly. That'd be dull. So, if you don't say your guesses, they won't know. Got it?
Before she could do anything else, he plopped his glass on top of a passing servant's head, who did not seem to notice it.
Well, thanks for perking up my night. You know, you kept this show from being canceled. Started to get predictable and boring, and I don't really do boring. Maybe I'll come visit? Dunno. Don't think you'd like that.
He smiled, saluted her. The glass fell off the servant's head and smashed on the ground, startling everybody. Lori's skin goosebumped when he whispered into her ear, when he brushed against her ear, whispering into it. At the feeling of teeth, she did give a gasp. because there's really only so much even she could go without a physical response.
That saves me time before the debut.
It was on the tip of her tongue anyway, and Lori was sure he knew what she'd said anyway.
Chapter 3. Bomb.
Lori could still feel the phantom of the man's teeth on her earlobe. Rare for something like him to go about looking like a man, but not unheard of. Just odd. Another piece of information to tell Kuranes after this was all done. She could choose to fret and worry about what the hell was going to happen next, and in another time and day she might have. Right now, knowing that this was a debut for a princess? Lori watched people scrambling. There was still a lot of whispering, a lot of rumors. Some weren't even about the king. People were speaking of the union earlier with the two elephantine creatures. And some of the rumors were even good. Lori could allow herself to feel a little calmer, and she could allow herself to work on what to say as she presented her gift. Lori felt a sense of confidence. The kalimba wouldn't have been such a foolish gift after all. All she could do was listen and mingle, and Lori allowed herself to take in the beauty of the architecture of the throne room. Black marble floors, vaulted ceilings. Did places like this exist on Earth? It had been some time since she'd been there. As she took in the room, she spotted the man she'd seen earlier. A wave of murmurs. Lori's gaze snapped to the front of the room. The feaster from afar, the lord of interstellar spaces, the Peacock King, stood and unfurled himself at the far end of the throne room. Being a dreamer meant having magic. It came with your free entry into this dimension. It meant having a little more protection from seeing an elder god in full glory. It wasn't even looking at him that made her feel like she was moments from a migraine. No, she could handle things with squid faces that looked a bit raw. But it was when the air around them shimmered and you felt like you were standing at the edge of an abyss that was widening. As the ground rumbled beneath you, you would look down and realize that it was not an abyss at all, crumbling away, but a massive mouth with so many teeth. Had it been there the whole time? How couldn't you notice? He spoke, and all was back again.
My devoted subjects.
His voice was an approaching event horizon.
Welcome. Welcome to this most glorious day, a day of celebration. You are honored in my halls. Those of you who are here, you have been chosen for a great and precious thing, which has never occurred in all of known time, and will never occur again. For this day, I will present my child.
The congregants gasped on cue. Then again, if you knew something was going to happen, it would feel like it was.
I show you here one who has amazed me, one who has moved my spirit, who shines brighter than the stars of Dreamlands, and more brilliantly than the twin suns of Carcosa itself. She has risen above her filthy species, to show herself greater, better, superior to every other specimen of her wasteful, pitiful breed. I present to you Thoreau Lester Yellow, Princess of Carcosa, Duchess of Yetil, Countess of the Dreamlands, my daughter.
Light illuminated a small girl next to him. Lori didn't know what she'd expected. She knew the girl would be dressed expensively. She knew what human children damn well looked like. But she hadn't tried to imagine this mysterious princess, and she hadn't imagined a child being raised by the Peacock King to look happy, healthy.
Never again will you behold a human this magnificent. Though, as I understand, some of you have forgotten what they are, I have ensured a proper model for you to compare her radiance against. As such, I also present one whom the humans have occasionally celebrated in their little villages. One of their more creative spawns, who now attends my court as my slave.
Lori found herself thinking that he was putting it on a bit thick.
Karloff displeased me.
An understanding murmur rippled through the crowd as he both acknowledged and dismissed his former musician's death.
And while this foul creature has a great many flaws, he does have one meager skill of note. Behold, my new royal composer, Arthur.
A spotlight shone down on him now. It was cast differently than the one for the princess. While it was designed to make her look her best, warm and complimentary, this only made the man look ragged and beaten. Lori wasn't the closest to him, but her eyes were still strong enough to recognize him. Now she had his name, she supposed. Everyone's gaze, as directed by the king, fell on the man near the piano. Several courtiers near her giggled, and Lori made a noise so not to stand out. A carefully curated sound to display she'd seen something. A noise she made when she needed to make a noise, or else she thought she'd explode. Arthur stood near the piano. The anger in his eyes hadn't faded, and Lori now saw him without a glamour hiding. There, like skin grafts, was something bright and vague wrapped around the man. Through? Where she stood, she saw everything below the left elbow was a worn yellow. Well, that had been confirmed earlier. Had the man she'd spoken to just decide to let her see the passenger as a parting gift? Because she'd played a fun game? Then it clicked. Lori's eyes flicked to the king. They flicked back to the composer. She was not close enough to properly.
Our new court composer has prepared a piece for my little Thoreau.
Lori kept focused on the tattered scallops of the king, watching how they were moving like they were fabric made from a solar flare. And then the composer began to play, and Lori was drawn from the hypnotic movements and could only listen to the piano. She was not the first to begin the applause. She had to find her hands first. Lori felt struck. It was good. It was a skilled piece. She was lightheaded from this entire damn day. She thought of the first time she saw Hastur, and how she knew all the bones in her body. A thing more ancient than her species drifted above her, and Lori's nose had bled from the sight. She thought of the robes of the king, of the way solar flares kind of looked like that fabric in her mind. Would it be hot if she got too close to him? Good stationery, her mind helpfully suggested, and Lori came back to the present.
Thank you, Harper.
The little girl, the princess, had run up to him and was hugging him. Lori felt like the air had been squeezed from her lungs. Arthur patted her shoulders, and one hand lingered longer than the other. Lori was struck by the juxtaposition of the humans, by the similarity of the two. They were encouraged to form a procession because it was now time to present the gifts.
It's going to be received badly.
What instrument was that?
Something from Earth.
Lori practiced the speech in her head. If she practiced her speech in her head, then maybe she wouldn't think about how the composer looked similar to the girl, how he was old enough to have a daughter that age, how Lori was a bomb set to explode if she could not fucking defuse herself in time. With every tribute, Lori learned more about cities and countries in the Dreamlands, as well as other planets. Hastur was 5 tributes away now. She saw the worried expression and the simpering words. Another person had gone when she heard the quiet voice of the passenger. She could not openly study the composer. Everyone had snuck looks at him, but Lori wanted to do more than that. Now, close enough and with her eyes truly open, she could get a good look at them. Lori tried to watch them in her peripheral vision. Whenever the passenger spoke, the golden fabric that it was moved. Lori thought of chameleons changing color based on mood. When the passenger was speaking quickly, the shades of the fabric changed quickly, like water at a boil. When he was not, they slowed. It was rather hypnotic. The shade reminded her of solar flares. Lori felt her stomach plummet. She understood now. Arthur, the sad, gilded scarecrow, had a fragment of the King in Yellow in him. The human daughter of the King in Yellow was the biological daughter of Arthur. Lori was a bomb. She was close enough to hear another quiet conversation the pair had. It made her feel slightly skeevy. There was some irony in that, she supposed, at someone practicing espionage feeling guilt at eavesdropping.
She really does look happy, Arthur. I'm sorry.
Arthur shook his head. He'd gripped his other hand, or maybe that hand was gripping his. Intimacy came back to mind, strange and unusual though it was. This one didn't fit in any silo.
The guests are idiots.
This made Arthur almost smile.
They obviously didn't know this would be for a child. Fucking none of the gifts are appropriate. I think Hastur's getting a kick out of it.
Arthur snorted. No one else was acting like they could hear the conversation, or more importantly, the fucking voice of the other conversationalist. Lori was hearing the voice of the King in Yellow speaking inside this man's brain. Speaking casually with a person he had also just declared his slave and only fit to be a jester?
A representative from the C-suite city of Salafeus, known for its skilled artisans and dreaming king.
All attention was turned on her. In front of her, a sentient time abyss with a penchant for ripping minds to shreds had become aware of her presence. Lori felt heavy under his gaze. One tentacle was curled protectively around the back of that tiny human child, and it was such an absurdly tender motion from something like him that it almost seemed unreal. Almost.
A woman approaches now. Human, from the look of her.
Arthur raised his head, but it really seemed like he couldn't see.
She's wearing a gown of wrapped material in blue and white. It's elegant, smartly made. Unlike a lot of these stupid things, I think she could move in it if she needs to. She walks with confidence, but deference. She knows how to play the game, I think. I still have trouble with human ages. About 60, maybe, I think.
A moment later, just as she reached the spot for presentation...
Huh. Whatever she brought, it's small.
Look, Furrow.
He patiently drew her attention again to who had come before her.
Another human.
Hello!
The little girl peered down at her, and it was a remarkably human gesture of curiosity. Furrow considered.
Greetings from the great kingdom of he who...
slept beneath.
Haster murmured to her.
Slept beneath,
She proclaimed, trying to be authoritative. It reminded Lori of a tiny lion trying to growl. Right now, really damn cute. And in the future, very impressive with the potential to be very threatening.
Well done.
Lorraine bowed deeply. She compartmentalized while she did. She was going to give a present to a little girl whose life was very complicated.
Thank you for the invitation.
Her voice was bright.
It is a great honor to be in attendance, and it is even more of an honor to be able to be one of the first people to see Princess Faroe. She is a wonder, Your Majesty.
Short, sweet.
Kuranes has sent me with something from one of our prized artisans, in an effort to show two of our city's joys, and knowing that the king collects objects of beauty.
Indeed. We have been known to acquire such things as please the senses,
said Haster, even going the full royal we. Lorraine bowed her head.
As such, we hope this could find a place in your collection. It is made well enough that it can be touched and used without harm, if the king sees fit.
With that, she extended the gift. The little box that held the instrument was another artisan-made thing of beauty and curiosity. Faroe fixated on it at once.
What's that?
Haster didn't answer. He looked at Lori expectantly. Lori focused on the simple part of this. She'd made it too complicated. The knowledge given to her had made this complicated.
She's offering a small jeweled case, about the length and width of a book, but much thicker. And inside... Oh!
Arthur sat up.
One of the things the city, and the king I serve, is known for is our music. We thought that should your father want a beautiful piece of artwork, it would serve that purpose. We decided to bring a piece of art that also showcased our musicians. Would you like to see it?
It's some kind of instrument. A rectangular box with a hole in the top. And there are what look like metal tines secured to it in a V-shape over that hole.
Arthur must have whispered something.
Kalimba?
Repeated the king's voice, but not from the king's mouth. She looked like any other excited little girl being given a treasure box.
You may present it to my daughter,
he informed her, and steps appeared, sliding seamlessly, soundlessly out of the ground, leading up to Faroe's throne. Faroe, who was so excited by this development that she bounced a little, her shiny shoes clacking against the base of her seat. Lori met Faroe halfway, climbing just high enough to get on eye level with her, and no nearer the madness god than necessary, thank you very damn much. Lori was thankful her knees hadn't given her too much trouble over the years. She knelt when she was close enough to the tiny princess.
Hello, Princess Faroe.
She kept her voice light and high.
Let me hold it for you, and you can open the box. Do you see the little slide? Yes, just like that. You're a fast one. It's called a kalimba. You hold it in your hand and play it with your thumb. I've never had the knack for music myself, so I'm afraid you'll have to ask someone else for how to play it. Or learn as you go.
Because no one was ever going to take it from the kid, Lori could already see that. A little girl, she reached. Queen in training, she hesitated, looking at Haster again. He nodded. She looked like it really was a celebration for her and took the kalimba. Faroe stared at the gems, tilting the instrument to catch the light. Then she plucked one of the tines. The craftsperson really did a number with this one. It was glorious, a ping that shouldn't be nearly so melodic, nearly so resonant, but it was like the box itself had been designed to sing.
Daddy, look!
She plucked several evenly in a row, and Lorraine caught the musical training in it. She couldn't help but feel incredibly proud of herself.
Oh.
Furrow experimented, discovering it could be harmonized almost at once. She looked up.
Thank you.
A thoughtful and appropriate gift,
Rumbled the Lord of Interstellar Spaces. Lorraine felt her vision tilt sideways for a moment in fear.
We thank you. Celiphaeus has spoken well today.
So that got a few murmurs in the crowd. And if Hastur knew what she knew, they'd all be turned to ash. Lori took her eyes briefly off of the princess as she bowed and thanked them for the honor and caught sight of the court composer. She made brief eye contact with them, held it long enough to question whether it was intentional or not, and broke it without breaking stride. Behind her was a playful series of percussive notes.
If you enjoyed this production of Surrogate, the Director's Cut, please read the original written work on AO3, where it is still actively updating as of December 2023. A link is in the work notes, where you can also find the social medias of the production cast. Malevolent was written and produced by Harlan Guthrie, and all characters depicted here belong to their respective creators. The cast and management produced this show for no monetary gain, and all rights remain with the authors. Any sound effects or music used in this production were obtained legally or created by the production cast. Please let us know your thoughts, and, as Kane would say,
stay tuned for the next episode!